While everyone else was obsessing over the Fed's next move today, the real gravity of the global economy just shifted to a small town in Kyushu. TSMC isn't just building a factory, they're building a fortress.
You're talking about the earnings call from last week, right? January 15th, TSMC basically broke the internet. I was just reading this morning that their 2026 capital expenditure is projected to hit an eye-watering $56 billion.
Exactly. $56 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of entire nations. Everyone's talking about China's tech slowdown, but here's the number nobody is mentioning. TSMC's Q4 gross margin hit 62.3%. In this macro environment, that's not just performance, that's an anomaly.
And welcome back to Asia Tech Macro. I'm Maya, looking at the world through the lens of a founder who's seen too many pivot or die moments. And with me is Alex, who spent a decade at a hedge fund and still refuses to believe any number that doesn't have at least 9 zeros.
I prefer realistic, Maya. But look, the big news this week isn't just TSMC's cash, it's the Japanese government's response. Tokyo just signed off on a 1.23 trillion yen, that's about $8 billion, budget specifically for chips and AI in FY 2026. This isn't a trial run anymore. This is Japan saying we are the global semiconductor hub of the 21st century.
But Alex, let's look at the friction. I remember what happened in 2022 when everyone thought the Arizona fab was going to be the savior of the U.S. supply chain. Now, Arizona is struggling with labor disputes, while Kumamoto is ahead of schedule. Why is Japan succeeding where the U.S. is stumbling?
It's the Japan discount, Maya. And no, I don't mean cheap electronics. With the yen sitting at 150 plus, even with today's BOJ pause at 0.75%, Japan has become a high-tech bargain bin. It's actually cheaper to build a 2-nanometer plant in Japan right now than it is to build a high-end data center in California.
Wait, really? Cheaper? But the talent war in Japan is getting brutal. I heard reports that Sony and TSMC are practically poaching engineers from each other's parking lots. Is there enough brainpower in Kyushu to support 3 fabs?
It's a bottleneck for sure. Wendell Huang, TSMC CFO, hinted at operational complexities, which is analysts speak for, we can't find enough people who know how to run these machines. But here's what most people miss. The Japanese government is now paying for the training. They aren't just giving money for walls and machines, they are funding the human capital.
That reminds me of the early days of the Shenzhen boom. But here's a question for our listeners. Is Japan's revival a structural shift or just a temporary side effect of the weak yen? If the BOJ hikes to 1.5% by summer, does the TSMC love affair end?
That's the trillion-dollar question. But before we get to the BOJ, we need to talk about what's happening across the sea in Seoul. Because while TSMC is winning the logic war, the memory war for HBM4 just entered a very ugly phase. Every investor is obsessed with the Fed's next move. But while you were sleeping, the real gravity of the tech world just shifted to a small town in Kyushu, Japan. Forget Silicon Valley. The real alpha is currently in Kumamoto.
You're talking about TSMC's earnings call from last week, aren't you? I was just reading this morning that their January 15th report was basically a love letter to Japanese industrial policy.
Exactly. While the Arizona fab is still wrestling with, let's call them cultural frictions and labor disputes, the Kumamoto expansion is moving at a pace that is frankly terrifying for the competition. Everyone's talking about China's slowdown, but here's the number nobody is mentioning. TSMC is projecting up to $56 billion in Capex for 2026. That is larger than the entire GDP of many European nations, Maya.
It's staggering. And welcome back to Asia Tech Macro. I'm Maya, coming from the startup world where we move fast, and with me is Alex, a man who looks at a $56 billion spending spree and asks, where's the margin dilution?
Guilty as charged. But look at the data. TSMC's Q4 revenue, which hit nearly $34 billion with a gross margin of 62.3%, shows they aren't just spending, they're dominating. However, Wendell Huang, TSMC CFO, did admit that global expansion might bite into those margins by 2 or 3%. But Maya, here's what most people miss. The Japanese government isn't just giving subsidies, they are essentially co-signing the entire ecosystem.
You mean the 1.23 trillion yen, about $8 billion, that Tokyo just earmarked for the 2026 semiconductor budget?
Precisely. Japan is covering nearly 50% of the cost for some of these projects. If you're a shareholder, you don't care about a 2% margin dilution if half your factory was paid for by the Japanese taxpayer. It makes Japan the most cost-effective advanced manufacturing hub in the world right now, especially with the yen sitting at 150 plus.
Wait, really? But Alex, the talent war in Japan is getting brutal. I've heard from founders in Tokyo that Sony and TSMC are practically poaching engineers from each other's parking lots. Is the talent pool deep enough to support a second and third fab?
It's the primary bottleneck. Japan's Rapidus project, the state-backed 2-nanometer dream, is also hungry for that same talent. They just secured another 5 billion yen from JX Advanced Metals last Tuesday. It's a total war for brains. But here's a question for our listeners. In 2026, would you rather bet on a country with a talent shortage but high government support, like Japan, or a country with plenty of talent but massive geopolitical volatility, like China?
That's the trillion-dollar trade-off. Speaking of China, we have to talk about the Nvidia tax. I was checking the news feeds, and the reports about the 25% access surcharge on AI chips are sending shockwaves through the Shenzhen markets.
It's the ultimate contrarian move by Washington. Instead of a total ban, which just fuels the black market, they're essentially taxing China's AI progress to fund U.S. domestic chip production. It's brilliant and brutal at the same time.
But doesn't that just accelerate China's shift to domestic alternatives? Huawei's Ascend 920 series is reportedly gaining massive traction because of this.
It does. I was looking at a report from an analyst at Jefferies who noted that Nvidia's market share in China could drop to under 10% by the end of this year if this surcharge stays in place. But here's the devil's advocate view. Does China actually have the lithography capability to produce those 5-nanometer chips at scale without ASML's latest gear?
That's where it gets murky. SMIC is claiming breakthroughs, but the yields are the secret everyone is hiding.
Speaking of secrets, the biggest one in Seoul right now is why Samsung is still breathing down SK Hynix's neck despite losing the first round of the HBM war.
It's a brutal cycle. I was looking at the preliminary earnings from Samsung that dropped last week. A 900% year-on-year jump in operating profit looks incredible on a headline, but let's be real. That's coming off a rock-bottom baseline from 2024 and 2025.
Exactly. It's a recovery, not a breakthrough. Meanwhile, SK Hynix is reportedly hitting 80% yields on HBM3E. In the semiconductor world, an 80% yield on a stack that complex is basically black magic. They've essentially locked in Nvidia's supply through the end of 2026.
Okay, but devil's advocate here, Samsung just announced they're skipping a sub-generation to go straight to HBM4 mass production by the end of this year. They're betting the farm on the all-in-one approach, logic and memory on a single die. If they pull that off, doesn't SK Hynix's lead evaporate?
If is a very expensive word in a hedge fund office, Maya. But you're right, the foundry plus memory synergy is Samsung's only path back to the throne. But while those two giants are beating each other up, have you noticed who's actually collecting the checks?
You're talking about the picks and shovels play again. Tokyo Electron and Advantest?
Bingo. I was reading a note from Kenji Nakamura at Goldman Sachs yesterday. He pointed out that regardless of who wins the HBM4 race, the metrology and etching requirements are so insane that the capital intensity is doubling. Tokyo Electron's backlog is now at a record high. They aren't just selling tools, they are selling the only way to make AI work.
That reminds me of what happened in 2022 during the first big EV surge. Everyone bought the car makers, but the real money was in the lithium processors. But Alex, let's pivot to our contrarian corner.
My favorite part of the day. What's the consensus we're destroying today?
The consensus is that Japan is the new safe harbor because it's stable and predictable. But I think that's a trap. Is Japan actually a safe harbor, or is it just a high-tech discount hub that only exists because the yen is fundamentally broken?
That's a sharp one. Look, everyone is piling into the Nikkei because they are terrified of China. It's a trade by exclusion. But here's what most people miss. The Japan discount isn't just about the currency. It's about the fact that Japanese engineers are now 40% cheaper than their counterparts in San Francisco or even Hsinchu. We are seeing a massive brain gain back to Japan because for the first time in 30 years, Japan is the most cost-effective place to innovate.
So it's not just a safe place, it's a value play. But that value disappears the second the Bank of Japan gets aggressive. If we see 1.5% by December, does the party end?
The party doesn't end, but the guests change. The speculators leave, and the long-term industrial capital, the TSMCs and the Intels, stay. Because once you build a $20 billion fab, you don't care about a 10% currency swing. You're there for the next 20 years.
Speaking of the next 20 years, let's look further south. We can't talk about Asia Tech in 2026 without mentioning the sovereign AI rush in ASEAN. I was just reading that Malaysia and Vietnam are now fighting over a $10 billion Google data center project.
It's the new digital Silk Road. Every country in Southeast Asia has realized that if they don't own their own AI clouds, they're just digital colonies of Silicon Valley. But here's the bottleneck: power.
AI data centers are energy vampires.
That's why Indonesia is winning. They have the nickel for the batteries and the geothermal power for the stacks. It's a vertical integration of the entire AI supply chain.
Okay, let's wrap this up with something the listeners can actually use. Action items for the week of January 23rd.
Action item 1. Watch the HBM4 certification news like a hawk. The moment Nvidia gives a thumbs up to Samsung's 12-layer stacks, the valuation gap between Samsung and SK Hynix will start to close in hours, not days.
Action item 2. Look at the Nvidia Tax winners. If China really is losing access to H200s due to that 25% surcharge, the real winners aren't just US firms. Look at the Malaysian testing and packaging firms. They are the ones who will be handling the redirected supply chains.
And action item 3. Don't ignore the yen carry trade ghosts. If the BOJ makes a move, the first things to get sold aren't the Japanese banks. It's the high-flying tech stocks in Taiwan and India. Keep your stops tight.
Great insights, Maya. To our listeners, Asia isn't a single market. It's a high-stakes chessboard. And right now, the king is in Taiwan, but the queen is moving to Japan.
And the pawns are turning into knights in Southeast Asia. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week to discuss the deep-sea mining race for semiconductor minerals in the Pacific.
Stay cynical, stay data-driven.
See you next time on Asia Tech Macro.
Goodbye.
Bye.